Welcome to WonderPod. WonderPod is the official podcast of WonderFest, Ireland's first online children's book festival. I'm your host, Conor Bredin. In this podcast, we'll be discussing everything there is to talk about with children's books. I'll be talking with Ireland's top writers, illustrators, publishers, agents, and more. You can find out more about WonderFest by heading to wonderfest.ie. Now, on with the show. Well, hello there everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of WonderPod, the official podcast of WonderFest. And yes, I said whale hello there everyone, not well hello there everyone. That's my government mandated whale pun of the episode. I'm glad I got it out of the way. Thank you to the person who DM'd me on Twitter for the suggestion. In today's episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing authors Shane Hegarty and Swapna Haddow, as well as illustrator Sheena Dempsey. Thanks as well to everyone for listening and enjoying the episode last week with Paddy Donnelly, Una Woods and Priscilla Cruz about picture books. But this week, we're going to be talking about chapter books, which is kind of the next age group or age range up from picture books. But first, a little bit about our guests this week. Shane Hegarty was the arts editor for the Irish Times in a past life. His first book series, Darkmouth, or I always said Darkmouth, but he says Darkmouth, so I should say it the way he says it, Darkmouth, was nominated for the Waterstones Prize as well as an Irish Book Award. His next series, Boot, has been nominated for many prizes, as well as having been chosen as the Dublin UNESCO City of Literature Citywide Read for 2020. He also has a column in the Sunday Times. Swapna Haddow is the author of the Dave Pigeon series, which has won 3 regional awards in the UK and was shortlisted for the prestigious Sainsbury's Children's Book Award. Swapna loves to write about boisterous animals that cause mayhem and is working with Faber and Faber, Stripes Publishing, Scholastic, Oxford University Press and Macmillan. I mean, is there a publisher that she's not working with, folks? Come on. And her book, Bad Panda, was illustrated by my third guest today, which is Sheena Dempsey. Sheena is an illustrator, cartoonist and author. She has illustrated for books such as Swapna's Bad Panda and her Dave Pigeon series. She's also illustrated for Niall Breslin, aka Brizzy, for his book The Magic Moment, for Mermaid School, and for much, much more. She has also won multiple awards, including for Dave Pigeon and The Magic Moment, as well as having been awarded a bursary award from the Irish Arts Council not once, but twice. So, as you can see, my 3 guests today are more than qualified to talk to all of us about chapter books. Before I go on to that though, I'm just going to remind you of another event that maybe you might be interested in for the festival itself. So there are one group of webinars that are called the Proper Book events. Proper Book is all one word. And they came from the idea that when someone finds out that, oh, you write children's books, great, but when are you going to write a proper book? And guess what, everybody? Children's books are proper books as well. Sometimes they can be harder to write than books for adults. So we have a Proper Book webinar. It's titled So You Want to Be a Children's Writer. It's going to feature Patricia Ford, who is chairing it, and you'll hear more from Patricia in a couple of episodes ahead of us when we'll be talking about books as Gaeilge. We also have guests Rob Grant, Shane Hegarty from this episode, and Claire Wallace. Anyway, as I said earlier, Sheena, Swapna and Shane really know what they're talking about when it comes to chapter books. So let's hear what they have to say. Swapna, Sheena, Shane, how are you all doing? Thanks for coming on to the show.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I feel very out of place because I'm the only one on the episode today whose name doesn't start with S.
Connor.
Yeah, I'll just go. I'm Sonner for today for the purposes of the show. So we're talking about chapter books, and you're all authors and illustrators for chapter books. So I'd like to just ask, how did you get started in children's books in general before we go on to talk specifics? Swapna, why don't we start with yourself? How
did I get started in children's books? Well, I read a lot as a child. And then as a grown adult, I read a lot of children's books. I was very much part of the sort of Harry Potter phenomenon where I was sort of teenager and then grew up with the books and then obviously read the last one as an adult and just loved it so much. And I guess that kind of got me into the idea of writing children's books. I sort of fell into it weirdly. A friend of mine had her book published, and she saw I was making a book for my son and said, you should send this to my agent, it's really brilliant. And so I did, and her agent was obviously like, this is trash. But I thought, well, I might look into this. And I took a course online, and yeah, that's kind of where it came from. And I entered the Greenhouse Funny Prize, was shortlisted the first year, was crying the second year, and then re-entered the third year and won it, and sort of won an agent as well and a book contract. So it was a sort of mad whirlwind sort of thing that happened in 2014, and here I am now, still writing books. Very grateful for that.
Very good. And Shane, what about yourself? How did you first kind of get started with kids' books?
Well, I was kind of different. I'm a bit older, so we didn't have a huge amount of children's books, or at least there wasn't that easy jump from children's books to kind of what we now call middle grade books and YA when I was younger. So I'd always wanted to write the kind of stories that I ended up reading when I was sort of about 13, 14, which were stories that were sort of fantasy filled and adventurous and a bit surreal and had lots of jokes in them, and definitely were formed by jumping very quickly on to, say, Douglas Adams and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which would have been which is the touchstone book for me, really, for everything that I've done. But I'd always wanted to write that kind of story. And when I came to write Darkmouth, which was the first book I wrote, I wasn't really sure what age I was writing it for, but I was writing it for myself, really. And it was, first off, and it happened to have all those elements that really appealed to me when I was younger, which is, and the great thing about young readers is they will take an enormous amount of those things. They love books that are surreal, that have cliffhangers, that have jokes, that have exaggerated characters, that have drama, but that feel ultimately grounded as well and that are recognizable. And I guess when I sat down to write my first story, that's what I wanted in a book, and that's what younger readers like in a book. And I had been reading a lot of, I discovered, I suppose, that new generation of writers, especially the likes of Owen Colfer and Derek Landy, and realized these are the books that I wanted when I was that age, and have been lucky enough to get away with it since.
Get away with it, he says, like as if it's a crime or something.
It does feel like that. Every writer knows, every book feels like, you do feel like I've got away with it again. I've just read copy edits on a new book, and it's like, I seem to have got away with this. Nobody's told me this isn't being published. So they'll find out in the next book what a disaster this whole adventure has been.
It's that constant fear of being found out that you actually don't know what you're doing all along, and you shouldn't be trusted. Sheena, you, of course, as our illustrator on the episode today, I'm sure you have a totally different journey to working with children's literature. So tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so going back to when I was a kid, I guess I was always like a big reader, and my mum really encouraged reading. And I actually remember when we moved house when I was like 16, one of my big regrets in my life is that I threw away, or kind of gave away, most of my childhood collection of books, except for my Roald Dahl collection, which I still have, which are like dog-eared and like scribbled on and stuff. But yeah, like I was a massive reader kind of thing, but I never really connected the idea that I could illustrate books, because I feel like I didn't know any illustrators in real life. I didn't know, like, there weren't any that came to our school. I didn't know that it was like a job kind of thing. So when I was coming to do my application for university, I was like, I want to like draw and paint. So I went to do fine art, and I actually found that really challenging because it really wasn't for me kind of thing. So I made like 2 attempts at it, and I finally got my degree, but it wasn't where I wanted to be. Like it was like, I'm much more into like narrative than like concept in terms of like art. So like I just find it much more interesting, like illustration. So I eventually, after a few years after my fine art degree, I decided to do a master's in illustration, and I came to London. And then I was just really lucky that I got a 2-book deal from Walker Books. for my own kind of picture books coming out of uni. So that was like a stroke of luck kind of thing, and then it just progressed from there.
Very, very good. And I feel like there's a question I'm going to ask every illustrator that I'm going to have, but for you, what is the kind of what's the attraction to doing art for books as opposed to doing art that's a standalone piece of art, if you know what I mean?
I just enjoy it so much more. Even when people ask me to do like commissions, like portraits or whatever, I just don't enjoy it as much. And I struggle with it a lot more than if it's for books. I don't know why that is. I just feel like it's really where my heart is like drawing children's illustrations. You know, it's just so much more fun, I think. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. So a question for all of you, and whoever wants to go first, it's fine. So this episode is all about chapter books specifically. And like, I've been working with WonderFest for a while now, so I feel like this is all very easy language to understand, but it mightn't be to somebody who's just thinking of getting started in kids' books. So what is a chapter book as opposed to any other definition of children's books?
I might jump in here first so that we don't go through everyone and then I just say what she said. So from my understanding, because books are so weirdly categorized, and honestly, it doesn't really matter what age you are and what book you really pick up. So, you know, I'm a grown adult who loves picture books and I will always read them. But from my understanding, a picture book is sort of for the age range of 5 to 8 year olds. So kids who are newly independent readers, who still like to be read to aloud, or still want to be read to aloud, or might struggle with reading an entire sort of chapter book on their own. There are illustrations in the book, so it's not fully illustrated like a picture book, and it's not without illustrations like older books, so middle grade and YA. Although, having said that, you know, spot illustrations are creeping in more and more into middle grade and YA books anyway. And they're sort of quite short, but they feel like a weighty book. So there are not as many words on the page as a middle grade book, but they've got the same format and they're probably about the same thickness as a middle grade book. So that's a chapter book, and they're like short, punchy chapters. That's what I think a chapter book is. And to be honest, 5 to 8, someone who's 5 reads something completely different to someone who's 8. Yeah. So they really vary in length. And I've written chapter books for the earlier years, so those who are about 5 or 6 years old, and they're full colour, and they almost look like picture books, really. And then Sheena and I work on the Dave Pigeon and the Bad Panda series, which is for the slightly older ones in that group, so the 7 to 9s or 7 to 8. And Bad Panda actually has a bit of colour in there, but Dave Pigeon's black and white. So it's really varied, but essentially they're books with chapters.
Anything to add there, Shane?
No, I mean, Swapna was saying, it's so, the categorization of books is a strange thing, and sometimes there's a need to categorize things, and yet at the same time everything can be over categorized. And all you have to do is walk into a bookshop or you know, to see that where everything is segmented, and yet kids will pick from everywhere, you know, and they'll and I know as having a, you know, 4 children of my own of a range of ages, that it's amazing how older readers will often still read picture books, and young readers will sometimes kind of pick up much older books, and it, you know, they're all individual. But I guess for me, there's maybe just that slight psychological, it's almost a psychological thing. I remember what I would consider the first chapter book I ever read was Winnie the Pooh. And I remember it being when I perhaps became a newly independent reader at the age of maybe 7 or 8, when I first got that book, and reading 30 pages of it on the first night, and loving the illustrations and loving the story, and feeling that this was different to the books I had been reading before. That there is just, maybe it's almost a sort of a psychological step, and I see it with my own children, where they go from, I suppose, reading of books where they're absorbing everything on it without maybe always even reading the book, or it's a combination of pictures and words, and it's the whole experience of it. I don't know if that's making much sense, but they, to a point where they maybe read the story with the pictures and kind of understand it on a suddenly, independently, and on, where they will sit at night and read a story on their own. Is maybe it's that sort of strange little crossing point, I suppose, where you get into chapter books. And oddly enough, while they are almost entirely chaptered books, there are books like Rabbit and Bear, which is simply one long story with fantastic illustrations, and yet that's a chapter book. I think you could argue that Dogman, even though it's effectively a graphic novel, is also a chapter book, because it tells the story in chapters, and there's reading as well as, even if it's extremely visual. So it is a broad area, but I do feel, as I said, that it's there's almost a psychological crossing point where chapter books become, for the reader, a reader almost understands what a chapter book is as much as anybody else, what it means to them. Does that make any sense? I'm not sure if it does, but
no, it does. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that psychological change, because speaking as a teacher, primary school teacher, you can see the kids that are ready to, it's funny, children will often say, and Sarah Webb is going to hate me for saying this, that they want to read a proper book. But that's how kids look at it. They look at a chapter book as opposed to a picture book. A picture book, the picture is, and maybe Sheena, you can correct me on this when I finish my point. With a picture book, the picture is the main star, kind of like the story is like the pictures are informed by the stories, but the picture is the main star. The picture is the attraction. Whereas with a chapter book, it's a little bit more that the words are the attraction. And I think for kids, knowing that I have to be able to read to fully understand this story, and I can, that it's that psychological thing, like you were saying, Shane. It's that step up. Am I hitting the nail on the head, Sheena, or am I totally way off base?
Yeah, I think, pictures in a picture book, I suppose you're a storyteller in your own right, but when you're illustrating, you're helping to tell the story, but you're illustrating the story in a literal sense, kind of thing. Yeah, definitely. Like with a picture book, I think you have more control, like, I'm not power, but like, you're more a storyteller, I think, than you are in chapter books. Yeah. And I think the difference between making picture books and chapter books as an illustrator is that picture books, even though they're 12 spreads, so kind of like 12 paintings sometimes almost, it is still like, and there could be like hundreds of drawings in a chapter book. It still takes, I think, longer to do a picture book. Because so much design and stuff has to go into each page, because they're usually bigger and stuff. It's harder to draw big. But sometimes chapter books, like Dave Pigeon books, I think they give you like 4 months to do a chapter book, and maybe 7 to do a picture book usually. So,
and not only that, but
I was just gonna add another thing. I think the really important thing about chapter books is that actually that's the time when you can really build a reader, and that's the point at which you turn a child who's been reading schemes and that kind of stuff from school into a child that reads for pleasure, and then they'll go on. It's a gateway book, a gateway book to middle grade and sort of beyond. So they're really crucial, even though I personally feel they're slightly underrated, but I'm biased because chapter books are my jam, so I'm forever championing them.
I don't think they're underrated at all. I think they're like make up a huge part of the market.
Well, they don't get appreciated, say, in awards or reviews in the same way, say, a picture book or a middle grade or a YA book is what. Yeah.
That's why I've not won anything, and now I'm sticking with that now.
So just want to move on, because I do want to talk about, from a aspiring children's writer and representing all the aspiring children's writers that are listening, Swapna and Shane in particular, how, like, what is a publisher looking for in a chapter book as opposed to like a picture book or a middle grade? Like, if you're writing something and you'd like it to be a chapter book, how do you make sure it's wordy enough for a not to be a picture book and not too wordy that it ends up categorized as middle grade?
I think, so speaking from my experience of writing chapter books, one thing that has been key is that it's very character based. So your character is your main focus. You've got a really strong voice and a strong character, because then you could plonk them in any sort of situation where, you know, they're going to the moon or they're going to the newsagents, and there's an adventure because their character would dictate how that story's going. I think having a strong character means there is series potential, which is always appealing to a publisher. So if they think they can get a few books out of this one character, because that's the one thing about this age group, because although, you know, anyone can read these books, primarily the 5 to 8 year olds are heavily invested in a character. They like to collect all the books, all the stickers, all the, you know, the outfit, wear the costume for World Book Day. They're super, you know, invested in the characters that they read. So if you've got someone who really appeals to them, that works well. I think that appeals to publishers. I think they also, it's not necessarily so, but I think also funny works a lot in this sort of group. So if you can write something funny, that's usually useful, but doesn't mean everything has to be funny. I would say, I don't know, maybe Shane could help with this, but I'd say the word count is usually below 20,000, but above 1,000. So somewhere between there is some happy medium. So Bad Panda is probably about 10,000 words or so. Dave Pigeon is closer to the 20,000 mark. And then I've also got the Ballet Bunny series, which is for the younger end, and that's illustrated by Benny Talib. Those are, God, they're pretty short. I think they're probably about sort of 4,000 words a book, or somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 words a book. So yeah, anywhere between sort of probably about 3,000 and 20,000 is about a chapter book length. But honestly, a story is as long as it needs to be. Yeah. It's funny because we get sort of hung up on word counts, and then you get a publishing deal, and then they're just like, write what you need to write, you know. So yeah, I think that's probably about right, I would have said. I think Shane's probably got more insight into this than I do.
No, I'd agree. I mean, so with Boot, I would tend to, it's for a slightly older end of this age range. So they come in at about 18,000, I think. And I'd be lying if I was to say I wasn't sort of aiming more for sort of 15, 16, but it just
spills over.
Yeah. And your editor will tell you if you've written too much, or if you need more. I mean, that's what editors do. Like, there's a huge difference between that and say the the Dartmouth series. I think that's about 65,000 words, and that was a more middle grade. You know, that's you're stretching into the teenage kind of readership for Dartmouth. It's and so that's a quite, and in terms of writing, as you said, for prospective writers, there is a big difference in the challenge of writing, say 18,000 words compared to writing 65,000 words, simply because of the scale of the story. You usually find with the shorter books that the focus of the plot will be fairly linear to an extent. That this is for me anyway, that you kind of, okay.
No, same for me as well.
So this has happened. This is what they need to fix it. This is where it all goes wrong, and this is how they make it right at the end. But it's usually one thing. Boot, in this case, wakes up in a grinder with 2.5 memories, sets out to find its owner, Beth, and that is the story. And along the way, meet some other robots, but the whole progress is towards that point. So often when you're writing for if you're writing for 6, 7, 8-year-olds, you're writing, I mean, the trick is, as always, is to write slightly older. They tend to write slightly older if you're writing a human character than the readership, but that's just that's one of those tropes of the business. So there are those different elements you have to think of when you're heading into it, and it helps to know roughly what you're going for. But you'll often find that if you're writing a story, that the publisher will then tell you this is for this age group, because you mightn't. As I said, when I wrote Dartmouth, I didn't really know what age group I was writing for. I just knew it was for a younger reader, whatever age that might be.
Mm. So thank you so much for that, Swapna and Shane. That's really going to help our aspiring authors, but I have to pay attention equally, of course, to our aspiring illustrators. So Sheena, you kind of mentioned this earlier, but like with what for you are the key differences you have to remember when you're drawing a chapter book as opposed to a picture book? Like obviously with the picture book, the pictures are bigger and there's more detail and everything, but there's, correct me if I'm wrong in saying this, there's more illustrations in a chapter book usually. It's just there's lots of smaller ones. So what's the differences you have to bear in mind when you're doing a chapter book?
Yeah, I think, yeah, chapter books, they're just like, you can have anywhere from like, it's usually about 50 and then like up to like 130 or whatever. So I think Bad Panda is quite heavily illustrated. There was, well, actually it was kind of, there's a bit of a story behind it where they were like, oh, do you want to save yourself time? And, or I think it was more about more creative control kind of thing, if you want to like lay out the book yourself. So usually with chapter books, you'll be given like a PDF and it has gray spaces for, you know, the pictures, and it'll be like, you know, draw a mean cat here kind of thing or whatever. So Faber said you can kind of pick whatever you want to illustrate. You can decide how many like full pages or spots or whatever. So I had great fun doing the roughs, but I ended up drawing like 134 pictures, and I don't think they intended me to make that much work for myself. So when it came time to doing finals, I was like, someone like save me, because it was just like, I just made way too much work for myself. So for book 2, they ended up like laying it out again so that I could, and they've managed the number of illustrations so that I haven't made too much work for myself. So I would say for Bad Panda, it was probably more work than a picture book. It was kind of like doing 2 picture books, but usually for a chapter book, it's less work than a picture book, because it's spots, and there aren't as many full double page spreads, which are the ones that take a long time. Mm-hmm. And usually you will be told, like, you'll just be given a manuscript, like a PDF with all the layouts, and you just draw what they kind of indicated that you should draw. So that's one thing that's different. Again, like usually you're also drawing in black and white normally. With Bad Panda we have red as well, but black and white just shaves down a lot of time, because you don't have to worry about color. You just have to worry about like contrast and, you know, what you're drawing kind of thing. And yeah, there's something about a picture book that is just like, it's just so much work, because there's so much to consider, right? It's like, you know, and you're also deciding what to draw when you're doing a picture book, and then just so much work goes into the design of the spreads and the kind of all of that. It's much more work, I think.
Do you think it's worth having for aspiring illustrators, do you think it's worth having black and white spot illustrations in your portfolio? Or
100%.
Stole my question, Swapna.
Sorry.
I literally thought of the same.
I have an 11-year-old aspiring illustrator, so
I would say definitely, like your portfolio, if you're want to be an illustrator, should be a combination of color and black and white. And I remember when I was first starting, and my agent at the time, Penny Holroyd, she was like, just like give yourself some assignments, like as in like draw random scenes kind of thing, and like a birthday party or this or that. So like you should just invent scenes for yourself and develop a black and white kind of visual, as well as having, you know, characters in different positions, like showing consistency throughout your portfolio, full spreads, spots, and like, you know, half pages or whatever. I think just try and cover all bases, and environments as well is important to kind of show that you can do like interiors or nature, and yeah.
Okay. That's brilliant. So now you kind of started answering the question before I asked it, but that's good. So Swapna and Sheena together, when Bad Panda was going, like how much, if any, collaboration was there between the two of you? Or was it like, Swapna, did you have the manuscript done and then it was given to Sheena and you just had like a couple of consultations over and back? Or like at what stage in the process of the book does the illustrator come in?
So I think we was probably around book 2 of the Day Pigeon series, which was very much, I wrote the text and then Sheena would get it and do the illustrations. It was around that time our agents, suggested that we talk to Faber about what else we could do. And so Sheena and I actually had a conversation at that point and then talked about Bad Panda. And I said, I had this idea for this character who was, super cute, but just really was annoyed by being that cute. And then I put together a couple of chapters, and Sheena, in the meantime, worked on some character sketches. And we actually pitched it together. Well, our agent pitched it for us because we'd be hopeless. So it was very early on that we had been talking about this idea. And then when they said yes, I worked on the manuscript, and then once that had gone to sort of the final text with my editor, it went to Sheena. But we talk a lot during the process, and even now with book 2, Sheena, who I honestly don't know anyone who's more obsessed with raccoon videos, suggested we have a raccoon in the second book. So now there's a raccoon who has worked her way crowbarred into the second book because Sheena just needs an excuse to watch more raccoon videos. We work quite collaboratively, I suppose, compared to maybe most, because authors and illustrators are often kept apart. But very much still, I'll write the story and then Sheena will get the text, and then she will do the illustrations for that. But I think with Bad Panda, she has more autonomy now in terms of the storytelling, because there are graphic novel sections that I just can't really write. So Sheena lays those out and does the illustrations and sort of everything like that. And I don't know, Sheena, what maybe you don't think we work collaboratively.
Sheena, is that rare from the illustrator's point of view that you do work so collaboratively with the author?
I think so. I don't know, like Swapna, I think gives me too much credit sometimes. Like I think I'd say that I still, like, she writes the whole thing and then I illustrate it, kind of thing. But like, we definitely are friends outside of work, and we, are on WhatsApp every day, kind of thing. So, we're friends. But I give Swapna full credit for writing the whole thing. I mean, like, I do think for the comic book panels, I have to, it is storytelling in its own way, kind of thing. Like, yeah. And I'll do that. But yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, it's quite, yeah. I mean, it's as collaborative as you can probably make it.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because we definitely talk through ideas.
Sarah McIntyre and Philip Reeve, I think they really are genuinely collaborators in that series, where they, Sarah co-writes, I think, and then like he has a lot of input into her illustrations and stuff. So I think that is a real chapter book collaboration.
So Shane, how do you find that collaboration process? Like, Ben was the illustrator's name?
Ben Mantle is the illustrator for Boot, and it's quite different. And actually, that's really interesting. Of course, Philip Reeve and Sarah McIntyre, like Pugs of the Frozen North is another great example of a book which I think kind of constitutes a chapter book. But for me, no, it's much more of kind of the older sort of way, and probably the more the kind of standard way of doing it, which is I write a story, and then in the case of Boot and the next books that I'm writing, my publishers Hachette and my editor Rachel will then sort of match an illustrator to the books or to the story, and in the case of Boot, I would have been shown 2 examples of characters drawn.
Only 2?
What's that?
Only 2 characters?
Two separate illustrators, and what they had done with, given a brief, and then they'd drawn the characters. And
can you say who the other illustrator was?
I'm genuinely, I don't remember. Sometimes it's easier to just, because no, they actually didn't put,
They're anonymous.
they didn't put
A
names.
and B.
They didn't. I think I'm right in saying that I wasn't given names.
Okay.
And it was literally, here are the illustrations, and there's an element to it because you're looking at the first sort of almost kind of sketched version of an idea, and you just, in my case, you go by, I could kind of go by feel. That looks like they've got that character. That's more what I was kind of thinking. They've kind of read it and done, and Ben in that case just stood out. And then I give the story is written, and then they, in kind of collaboration with someone like Sam Perrott, who looks after a lot of the design aspects of the book over in Hachette, then they work out where the illustrations are going to be, where the spreads are going to be, where the beats of the story are that you need to illustrate. And then I see the rough versions of it, make some notes, and then they go back, and then they come back kind of completed. And usually at that stage, everything is fine. And Ben and myself do have a pretty kind of good relationship, thankfully, through it, and have done events together, and we'll chat every now and again, but we keep that aspect of it, the professional aspect, we're expected to keep it separate. Because not every case, I would imagine, you could allow the author and illustrator to just go off and figure it out themselves. The publisher in most cases will want to have a good overview of it, because they want to make sure it goes right and that it's kind of kept in check a bit. I don't, I've had a good relationship, thankfully, with both the illustrators of my books. James Delarue did the Dartmouth books, Ben did the Boot book. So I've never really had an issue or a problem, but I would imagine that there must be occasions where that can happen, or where I'm going to guess a writer more than the illustrator will do that thing that designers often have people standing, the virtual equivalent to people standing over shoulders going, can you make that hand a little bit more like handier? Is that possible to, and so the editors keep control of that and act as the gatekeepers for all of that. And in my case, and for me, I've found it a brilliant experience, and it's worked really well.
And here's a question I hadn't prepared, but it just came to mind for Swapna and Shane. You've both written more than one book, more than one chapter book, in the one series. So has the illustrations ever influenced something that you've written after seeing them? Like, I mean, with the case of Boot, with the design, was there ever like, Ben's always drawn a red button on his chest, maybe that red button does something in another book? Like, has there ever been anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. It informed, certainly for me. I think in the case of Ben's work, it probably knits quite well. I think that for me, the example of when an illustrator or illustrations work really well is when they kind of take your idea and they make it better. And that's the great thing. Like Ben's work, I have these visions in my head. I'm not at all artistic. I can't draw at all, like genuinely can't draw. But I do think quite visually. But so Ben, to see what Ben does with that is phenomenal, and then often just gives it that extra personality, adds character, which occasionally in the edit then you might just tweak to really emphasize aspects of it. But definitely in the case of Dartmouth, which again is it's middle grade, it's older, and I know that it's slightly off the chapter book track here, but there were maps at the start of those books, and I would have looked at maps and seen details in the maps that James had put in, which then I would say, oh, that's really interesting. I'm going to now take that. And in fact, I used to, at the events and talks that I would do, I remember being at one festival and somebody saying, what's that thing on the map? And it was the first time I'd noticed it. And that ended up being a big part of the story in a subsequent book. So no, definitely they can, and I think that's what makes illustrators so vital. And I kind of talk about it as being as sort of a superpower especially when I talk to kids, that it is a sort of a superpower, that ability to draw and to take a character and something which doesn't exist outside of the words on the page and give them such life. And definitely as a writer, you can be sometimes just simply kind of inspired by it and kind of buoyed by it, and both in the sense of, oh, that's what I wanted, and that's what I wanted to describe, and there it is on the page. And sometimes it's a case of going, oh, that's a really love the detail that's gone into that is then feeding back into what you're doing. So it can be a wonderful experience as a writer.
And Swapna, you've been nodding along the whole time there. Have you found
Yeah.
Sheena's illustrations or other illustrators' illustrations have, you know, changed or inspired something in your own books?
Yeah, I definitely, there's definitely things that I love seeing Sheena draw, and it makes me change what I'm going to write. So I love when Sheena, I know she hates this, but I love when she does a crowd scene, because they're just so brilliant. And each person in the crowd, not even person, each pigeon or each animal in the crowd has its own personality. And I really love those scenes. So I often try and get a crowd scene somehow into the book so that she has to draw a crowd scene. So I'm not happy with that.
I always do the last day of my deadline, and then it's a nightmare.
But yeah, I've definitely found things have happened like that. So like, more so with the picture book, actually. So I worked on a picture book with Dapo Adiola called My Dad is a Grizzly Bear. And when he drew the sort of initial family, there was something about the mum that reminds me a bit of a lion. And so when they asked for a second book, the natural progression was my mum is a lioness. And I don't think I would have gone down that route if I hadn't seen his illustration of the mum and thought, oh, she looks quite liony. Okay. Make that more liony. So yeah, I sort of suggested a very Shane, make that hand more handy, make that lion more liony suggestion, and wrote the entire book, My Mum Was a Lioness, based on his drawing of the mum. So yeah, I think definitely it's like Shane said, you know, when you write the story, it sort of is brought to life from this other angle, that because in your head you've seen it in a certain way, and if you let the illustrator just get on with it and you see it later on in the process, it's suddenly added another element to the story that you just never could have seen. Which is probably why they like to keep an author and an illustrator apart, because if you are sort of micromanaging it, you don't get that elevated level of this story that you would have got if you just let it be and let someone else do the next part of the storytelling.
I'd like to go on to our last kind of big question now, and I'm going to start with you, Sheena, if that's okay. When you started, for you, Sheena, when you started your illustration career, and then Shane and Swapna, your writing career for children, what's the one thing that you wish someone had told you or advised you or forewarned you? Like, what's the one thing you wish you knew earlier that you know now?
I think they did, but I just ignored it. Like, this is like...
Well, what's the one thing you wish you listened to?
I suppose like how hard it would be to make a living. I don't think I do anything differently. Like, I was warned so many times, like, oh, it's impossible to make money from children's books. And it is, no joking. It's like, it's possible. I don't know. I suppose like my advice would be to try and diversify your skill set. So I would say like a successful print shop, children's books, but maybe try and develop a little advertising kind of, you know, avenue of your work, or you know, just different ways, like maybe a bit of teaching on the side so that you can just like be more secure. Otherwise, I think I don't know. Yeah, sorry, that's all I can think of right now. But
that's really good. No, yeah. That's really good advice. I mean, from the illustrator point of view, you know, the more revenues sources and the more streams of income you have to do with your art, that means you can supplement and not focus on the one thing. Yeah.
Because books take so long. You know, you could be working on a book for months and months and make only a few £1,000s. It just makes more sense to kind of just try and diversify your skill set so you have a few streams of income, kind of thing.
Yeah. Swapna, what about yourself? What's the one thing you wish someone had told you before you started off in your writing career?
I would say, oh God, I can't really think. I think it's very reflective of what Sheena just said. You know, don't give up the day job even though you've got a book deal. Just, you know, I mean, it's the best job in the world. It honestly is. But you will be forced out of your comfort zone to do things that perhaps you not really thought you would do before. So events and things like that. You know, as a writer, it's quite a solitary process, and I certainly was not prepared to be in front of, you know, thousands of kids and, you know, essentially putting on a show. So yeah, you just know, okay, here's what, be comfortable in what you're doing. It's okay to say no to things. And especially if you've got an agent, you can ask them to advocate for you. So yeah, be comfortable and know that you don't have to say yes to everything. I'd say that was probably the advice I'd give myself, because I said yes to a lot in the early days and burnt out quite quickly, which was not useful. So yeah, I'd say it's okay to say no.
What about yourself?
I actually had a couple of pieces of advice early on, which I'm going to share, because you know, I think as with everything, you have to learn a huge amount of stuff on your own as you go along. And the weird thing that often happens with books is that you get lost in that particular book for a while, and then you move on to another one, and that other one so the book that you've done becomes this strange distant land that you visited once. And it can be, you know, and it's only after a while sometimes you appreciate what you had when you were doing it and all that. So it's certainly, if I was giving my own advice, it would be, you know, don't always just concentrate on that one thing you're doing right now, because, you know, and then you build up to it, and then suddenly everything is, because things tend to go quiet after a while. So you need to be thinking in the kind of longer term. What other stories do you want to write? What else do you want to do? But the couple of pieces of advice I did get that were fantastically useful. My agent, Marianne, said to me after my first book deal, which is that they're buying your voice, which was so important to me, because the story, which I was very proud of, this boy who had to fight monsters, didn't want to do it, the legend of myth invading his town, but actually the voice thing is so important. There are a lot of stories that people can write, but unless it's in a particular, you know, your voice has to be individual to you, and that's the thing that appeals to the publisher over everything else that is going to cross their desk. Has to be that distinctive voice that you bring to that story. And then the other thing is just on the sheer practical level, you know, if you're lucky enough to get a book deal, so much can go wrong. Somebody rang me and they had brilliant advice for when I got my first book deal, which was, you may lose your editor. Your editor might move job, and that happens a lot. You mightn't sell as many books as you want to sell. Things don't always go to plan. And I think you have to be prepared. I think as Sheena and Swapna are saying, to be kind of as nimble as you can, to kind of be adaptable as you can, and to find those things that you feel will help you navigate this kind of strange, weird job that we have, but wonderful job.
I was going to say, but it's a good job. It's fine.
It's definitely the best job in the world.
Yeah.
We're going to wrap up with I'll pick just 3 of our rapid fire questions just to finish us off. So I'd like you all to name a book that you wish you were a part of, either that you wish you had written or you wish you got to illustrate.
Anything that Sarah Crossan's written. I wish I'd written now. She's just brilliant.
Shane?
Well, look, I mean, I've always said Douglas Adams. Douglas Adams was so particular and so wonderful that I don't think there was nothing like it before The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and there's been nothing like it since. So I definitely feel I've sort of followed in his shadow to an extent, and to have had that mind and that ability would have been extraordinary.
I think one of my favorite books of all time is the 101 Dalmatians, and the edition that's illustrated by Alex T. Smith just totally took my breath away. And I hadn't read the book before actually until I read this version of it, but it's just perfection. Like, it's hilarious. The text is so funny, And also like Alex T. Smith's illustration is just like elevated so much. It's fantastic.
Excellent. If you had to choose one thing, reading or writing, and you have to give it up forever, but you still have the other one, which one would you pick?
Oh, writing. Writing's really hard. I like reading other people's books. I'd give up writing in a heartbeat.
Shane?
Yeah, I don't know. I find that question so completely sort of
cruel.
I'm going to say no, I'm going to be completely selfish and say I'd keep the writing, because it's been an impulse since I was 7 years old, and I don't know I'm completely unable to do anything else. I'm utterly useless at anything else. So I need the writing because it is quite genuinely the only thing I'm capable of doing.
I kind of know what you mean. I think, what would I do for money if I couldn't illustrate? I'd just be reading in my shack all day. But I also think, like, if I'm illustrating, I have to read, don't I? Because I have to read the manuscript,
yeah, you had to find it, didn't you?
Sheena's cheating.
Yeah, she did. My last question then is, where can people find you guys online and find Bad Panda and find Boot and Darkmouth?
So I have a website, swapnahaddow.co.uk, which I'm trying to keep updated. The books you can find in your local bookshop, so please shop local at your local indie bookshop. That'd be brilliant. But if you do go online, obviously the usual suspects, Waterstones, bookshop.org.uk, I think that's another one. And just anywhere they sell books, hopefully you'll find them. And if you don't find them, request them. Libraries, go to libraries, use your library.
Shane, where will people?
Oh, I'm on Twitter as well. Oh. God, this is so bad. Do you know what? Just edit the whole thing, Conor.
I've not got a website because I've spent too long trying to think about making a website and not actually done it, and I really need to do it. So you can Google me, and if and find that there's a Shane Hegarty who's a neuroscientist who's doing very well at the moment. So you can go read about him instead. And then none other than that, just go to your local bookshop or library, and hopefully my books will be there. And if they're not, order one in, and then ask for another 6 copies, and of course, order them in for all your friends. And then I knew somebody once used to order books into bookshops but not pick them up, just so they'd have them in. It was his own book, by the way, just to have them in.
I am at Sheena Dempsey or Sheena Dempsey on Twitter and Instagram, and I'd echo whatever Swapna said about where the books are available.
Excellent stuff. Guys, thank you so much for doing this. It's been a pleasure, and I can't wait to see and talk to you all during WonderFest itself.
Thanks, Conor.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Conor.
Thanks so much to Shane, Swapna and Sheena for coming onto the show and sharing everything that they know. That was a rhyme. I found it to be a really enlightening and fun interview to do. The one thing I've learned from each of them is just how important fun is in books for this age range. As Swapna said, chapter books are the gateway books. They're typically the books that turn children who can read into readers, which is 2 totally different things. So it's important to have something exceptionally funny and enjoyable to hook them into the lifelong habit of reading. Be sure to check out the show notes on your podcasting app or wherever you're listening, so you can find links to Shane, Swapna and Sheena's books, social media, and, well, not so much for Shane, websites. Anyway, tune in next Monday, where I'll be talking to Pádraig Kenny and Anne Murtha about the next age range in children's books, which is called middle grade. Now, for us in Ireland, middle grade is like, what does that actually mean? But it comes from the idea of middle school in America, which you'll hear all about next week. So what does middle grade even mean? What kind of stories can you write about for this age range? Come back next week to find out all of this and more. I'll see you all next week. Thanks for listening. I hope you found this as useful, as inspiring as I did. Don't forget that WonderFest is happening from the 17th to the 21st of November 2021. head over to wonderfest.ie to find out how else you can have a whale of a time. See you there!